Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, so today we're really diving deep, like really deep, into Fidel Castro's Cuba. And it's not just about, the cigars and the classic cars, though those are definitely part of the picture.
Right.
We're talking about a social revolution that totally transformed the country. And we're really going to dissect the how and the why with this academic lecture on Castro's policies as our guide.
Okay.
So get ready to, maybe rethink some of your assumptions as we unpack the good, the bad, and the really complicated.
Sounds good. Well, I think it's important to start by, kind of picturing Cuba before Castro came to power.
Okay.
Imagine a society that's just riddled with inequality.
Yeah.
You have this tiny elite, often foreign companies, controlling vast amounts of land and wealth.
Right.
Meanwhile, the majority of Cubans, especially in rural areas, they're struggling.
Right.
Education, healthcare, these are luxuries most can only dream of.
So it's like the stage is set for like a major upheaval, right?
Exactly.
And Castro, well, he certainly delivered on that.
He did.
And one of the very first things he does, like right out of the gate, is seize land from the wealthy.
Yeah.
And we're not just talking about random rich people here. He even went after his own family's holdings.
It was a bold move. For sure.
Bold is an understatement.
Yeah. Think about it. Over 200,000 peasant families, people who had never owned land in, generations, suddenly they're landowners.
Wow.
Yeah. It was a massive transfer of wealth and power.
I can only imagine what that must have done to Cuban society, overnight.
It sent shockwaves through every level of society.
And strategic, it makes sense, right? He's consolidating his power, gaining the support of the people who had been marginalized for so long.
Absolutely. He was creating a whole new power base loyal to him.
But I have to wonder, were there any unintended consequences down the line from, such a drastic move?
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it? Because, you see, while, initially it was definitely popular, especially among those who directly benefited.
Sure.
This rapid seizure of land, often without, clear legal processes, it created a lot of uncertainty and disruption.
Right.
Some argued that it discouraged foreign investment
That makes sense.
because they saw it as unstable, and they also worried about their own assets.
Sure.
So that's potentially hurting long-term growth.
So it's like a classic example of short-term gains maybe causing long-term instability.
Yeah, you could say that.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
And this whole idea of really swift and sweeping change under Castro, it wasn't just limited to land ownership, was it?
No, not at all. Take education, for example.
Okay.
Castro, he launches this huge national literacy campaign.
Okay.
He knew, really understood the power of an educated population.
Yeah, knowledge is power, right?
Exactly. And so Castro, he mobilizes thousands of young people,
Wow.
many of them students themselves.
Okay.
And he sends them out across the country.
To the most remote villages and everything.
Everywhere. Armed with books, with this, fervor to teach, to uplift their fellow Cubans.
That's amazing.
Within a year, illiteracy rates just plummet.
Wow.
It was remarkable, really, and it completely transformed Cuban society.
That's an incredible achievement to do that in such a short amount of time.
It really is.
But you have to wonder, was there a trade-off for such a rapid transformation of the education system?
Yeah, that's something to consider for sure.
Yeah.
Well, you see, with the literacy campaign, as amazing as it was, you have to remember that everything, the textbooks, the teacher training, even what was taught,
Right.
it was all tightly controlled by the government.
Okay.
So while kids were learning to read and write,
Yeah.
they were also, absorbing Castro's ideology.
So it's about controlling information as much as expanding access to it.
Exactly.
Interesting. Okay, so we see this tension between progress and control playing out in education. And it seems to be a recurring theme, this idea of trade-offs.
Definitely.
Let's talk about healthcare.
Okay.
Now, Castro's overhaul of the Cuban healthcare system, that's something that's still praised today, even by his critics. So before the revolution,
Yeah.
how difficult was it for the average Cuban to, see a doctor, get treatment, that sort of thing?
It was incredibly difficult for many, if not most,
Really?
especially if you were poor or lived in a rural area.
Right.
Quality healthcare was basically a luxury.
Okay.
Castro changes all of that.
So.
He declares healthcare a fundamental right, not a privilege.
Okay, I like the sound of that.
And he backs it up.
Okay.
Clinics are built. even in remote villages.
Wow.
There's this huge push for preventative care.
Sure.
They're training doctors, nurses,
Yeah.
and the goal is universal access, no matter who you are or where you live.
And it's not just about access either, right? I mean, Cuba's healthcare system, they're up there with some of the best in the world.
Absolutely. And on a fraction of the budget.
How do they pull that off?
Well, a lot of it has to do with their emphasis on, like we talked about, preventative care
Right.
and community health initiatives.
Gotcha.
But there's another factor that's like really important to understand. The Soviet Union.
Ah, okay. So they were getting outside help.
Massive amounts.
Like what?
Money, medical supplies, training, you name it, the Soviets provided it.
So their healthcare system, as impressive as it was heavily reliant on this outside support,
You could say that.
which, as we'll get into later, became a big problem during the special period.
Yeah.
But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's talk about housing,
Okay,
another basic necessity.
for sure.
So Castro comes in, dramatically lowers rents.
Huge relief for a lot of people,
I bet, especially in Havana.
especially in Havana, yeah.
I mean, imagine how much of your income would go to rent if you were, a working class family in Havana at that time.
A huge chunk.
So lower rents, that's a good thing, right?
On the surface, yeah.
But I'm sensing a but here.
Well, the thing is, when you lower rents that drastically,
Yeah.
it can discourage investment in new housing.
Oh, I see, because landlords aren't making as much money, so they're not as willing to build or renovate.
Right.
Fascinating. And the government, I mean, they couldn't just, snap their fingers and create more affordable housing.
No. And they really struggle to keep up with the demand.
So you have more people who can afford to live in the city, which is great, but not enough places for them to live.
Exactly.
A classic case of, good intentions but unintended consequences.
Definitely.
And did this, struggle to balance ambitious goals with, the realities on the ground, did that play out in other areas, too?
It's
What?
like employment, for example.
Okay.
One of Castro's big promises was full employment. And he pretty much delivered.
Really?
The state became the main employer.
Wow.
Guaranteed jobs for pretty much everyone.
Ah, that's incredible. But I have to imagine there's a downside to that.
There was.
What happens when everyone has a job, but there's no incentive to, work harder, be more innovative?
You hit the nail on the head.
Right.
It creates this kind of, stagnation.
Interesting.
It provided security, but not necessarily growth or dynamism.
Right.
And this lack of economic dynamism, it really came back to bite Cuba later on.
It's like this constant theme, progress in one area, but then this trade-off in another.
It's a story of Castro's Cuba.
It really makes you think about the human cost of these trade-offs, But it wasn't just about economics, right?
Right.
Castro also pushed for some major social changes.
We did.
Particularly when it came to, women and Afro-Cubans.
Yeah.
Groups that had faced a lot of discrimination in Cuba.
Absolutely. Yeah, Castro, he really saw, dismantling all forms of inequality, not just the economic ones, as central to his vision of revolution.
Right.
He knew women and Afro-Cubans had been pushed to the margins for centuries, and he saw their potential.
And how did that translate into actual policy?
Well, under Castro, Cuba made huge strides in things like literacy for women,
Okay.
access to healthcare, and you even saw more women, more Afro-Cubans in the workforce, in universities, places they hadn't been before.
So it's like they're actively trying to undo centuries of discrimination in a few short years.
Exactly.
That's pretty remarkable, but I have to imagine, with everything else we've talked about, there's got to be another side to this coin.
Right, because here's the thing. Castro might have championed social equality,
Yeah.
but he was not about to tolerate any challenge to his authority.
So even if you were fighting for, say, women's rights or racial justice, if it looked like dissent, it was shut down.
Exactly. You couldn't criticize the government, even if you were coming from what many would see as a progressive standpoint.
So you have these advancements in social equality, but at the same time, this real restriction on freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, that sort of thing.
There's this real tension, this real contradiction at the heart of the revolution.
And that seems to be the overarching theme here, right? This idea of trade-offs, of progress in one area coming at a cost somewhere else.
Absolutely.
And nowhere is that more evident than during what's known as the special period.
Yeah, the special period, it was this real turning point for Cuba.
So remind us, what exactly was the special period and what caused it?
Well, we have to go back to the Soviet Union.
Right, because they were providing so much support to Cuba.
Massive support, economic, military, you name it.
And then,
1991, the Soviet Union collapses.
just like that, Cuba loses its main benefactor.
Overnight, and it had a devastating impact.
Paint a picture for us. What happened in Cuba when that Soviet aid dried up?
Think like widespread shortages.
Shortages of what?
Everything. Food, medicine, fuel, even basic necessities were hard to come by.
Wow, so this is like a full-blown economic crisis.
Absolutely. The economy just tanked. People had to find really creative ways to get by.
That's wild. So the special period, it really exposed how vulnerable Cuba was because of this dependence on the Soviet Union.
It did, and it kind of forces you to ask, would things have been different if Castro had built a more self-sufficient system?
Right, if they weren't so reliant on one external power. It's a lot to think about, that's for sure. So where does this leave us? I mean, was Castro's revolution a success or a failure?
It's really not that simple.
I figured as much.
It's complicated. You have these undeniable achievements, particularly when it comes to things like healthcare and education.
Right.
But those achievements, they often came at the cost of individual liberties, at the cost of a truly dynamic and self-sustaining economy.
It's that constant tension we've been talking about.
Right, and that's what makes Castro's Cuba so fascinating to study, even today.
It's messy, it's full of contradictions, but it really makes you think,
And that's what history should do.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, there you have it, folks. Our deep dive into Fidel Castro's Cuba, a story of revolution, reform, and really tough choices.
It's a story that's still being written today.
Exactly, and it's a story that raises a lot of questions without easy answers, which is something we always love here on the deep dive. So keep those questions coming, keep exploring, keep learning, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive into history.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.